The courtroom fell into complete silence as Judge Theodore Grayson leaned back in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face. His voice, dripping with condescension, echoed through the room. "Miss Carter, do you even know where you are?" he asked, directing his question at a teenage girl with messy curls dressed simply in a hoodie and jeans. Her sneakers squeaked slightly as she shifted uncomfortably on the polished floor. "This is a court of law, not some high school debate team." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The attorneys seated behind their desks exchanged amused glances as the girl stood alone at the defendant's table, holding a stack of papers that seemed too heavy for her small frame. Her cheeks flushed, but her eyes remained steady, locked on the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm despite the jeers, but Judge Grayson cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Save it. This court doesn't have time for juvenile antics. I don't even know why the court allowed this nonsense." The girl raised her chin, her voice firm. "If you would let me speak, Your Honor, you might find it worth your time." The courtroom gasped. The audacity of a teenager speaking to a judge like that was unheard of. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his smirk turning into a scowl. "Well, by all means," he mocked, "enlighten us all." The girl took a deep breath, adjusted the papers in her hand, and began speaking. What followed left the courtroom in stunned silence. She delivered a seamless argument, citing legal precedents, constitutional clauses, and courtroom procedures. It became clear she wasn't just any teenager. She was knowledgeable, confident, and astonishingly correct. The attorneys who had been laughing moments before were now scribbling notes furiously. Judge Grayson's expression shifted from amusement to disbelief. "Who are you?" he blurted out, leaning forward, his voice now carrying genuine bewilderment. The girl met his gaze and smiled slightly. "I'm Amelia Carter," she said, "and I'm here to defend my client." The room erupted into chaos, questions flying from every direction. Judge Grayson banged his gavel, demanding order, though his own composure was clearly shaken. How could a teenager command the courtroom with such authority? Who had allowed this? What was going on? That's when Amelia's calm smile faltered, for the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. The courtroom fell quiet once more, all eyes on her. What was she about to reveal? 2 weeks earlier, Amelia had sat in her small bedroom, surrounded by law books and legal pads. The books weren't hers. They belonged to her older brother, James, who had been studying for the bar exam. But James wasn't around anymore, and Amelia had made it her mission to learn everything he had known. Her best friend, Lily, had called her crazy. "What are you even doing?" Lily had asked one afternoon, sitting cross-legged on Amelia's bed, munching on chips. "You're like 16. You're not a lawyer." Amelia had paused, her fingers hovering over her notebook, where she had been writing case summaries. She looked up at Lily, her expression serious. "I don't care what people think. I have to do this." "But why?" Lily pressed, her voice softening. "Why can't you just let it go?" Amelia hadn't answered right away. Instead, she flipped through one of James's old textbooks, furrowing her brow in concentration. Finally, she said, "Because someone has to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. And James believed I could do it." Lily hadn't argued after that. Instead, she had watched as her best friend threw herself into studying, preparing for something that seemed impossible. What Amelia hadn't told Lily, what she hadn't told anyone, was that her obsession with the law wasn't just about helping others. It was about proving something to herself. After James's death, people had treated her like a fragile child. Teachers, neighbors, even her own parents had tiptoed around her, as if one wrong word might break her. But she wasn't fragile. She wasn't a child. She was smart. She was determined. And she was going to show everyone that she could make a difference. Back in the courtroom, Amelia's composure had returned, but the tension was thick. Judge Grayson, still visibly flustered, leaned back in his chair and studied her closely. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "you're telling me you're representing the defendant?" Amelia nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "And where exactly did you study law?" he asked, his tone skeptical but no longer mocking. "I didn't go to law school, if that's what you're asking," she replied, her voice steady. "But I've spent the last year studying legal texts and court procedures. I've read every case related to this matter, and I believe I'm qualified to represent my client." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You believe you're qualified? That's not how this works." Amelia didn't flinch. "Then let me prove it." The courtroom was silent, everyone waiting to see what the judge would do next. But before Judge Grayson could respond, the door at the back of the courtroom swung open. A tall man in a crisp suit strode in. "Your Honor," the man said, his deep voice carrying across the room. "I believe I can shed some light on this situation." Amelia turned to look at him, her confident expression slipping into one of uncertainty. Who was this man, and what did he want? The tall man commanded attention as he walked with an air of authority, his briefcase swinging lightly in his hand. His sharp gray suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to Amelia's simple outfit. The courtroom's focus shifted entirely to him, murmurs growing louder as people speculated who he was and why he was there. "Excuse me, sir," Judge Grayson said, regaining his authority. "Who are you, and what business do you have interrupting my courtroom?" The man stopped just before the bench, placing his briefcase gently on the table. He turned to face the judge and gave a respectful nod. "My apologies, Your Honor. My name is Daniel Hayes, and I'm here as a representative of the Bar Association." The courtroom buzzed with surprise. Amelia's heart raced. Why was someone from the Bar Association here? Was this about her? She tightened her grip on the stack of papers. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "The Bar Association? What interest do they have in this case?" Mr. Hayes opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder, flipping through a few pages before responding. "It's not the case itself, Your Honor. It's the matter of representation." He glanced briefly at Amelia before continuing. "We received an anonymous tip about an unlicensed individual attempting to represent a client in court. Naturally, this is a matter we take very seriously." The air in the room felt heavy. Amelia's stomach dropped. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, and now it felt like everything was about to unravel. She swallowed hard and forced herself to stand tall. "Unlicensed," Judge Grayson repeated, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well, Mr. Hayes, I'm sure you can see why this is highly irregular. As I was just saying, Miss Carter has no formal legal training. Her presence here is questionable at best." Before Mr. Hayes could respond, Amelia stepped forward. Her voice was firm, though tinged with desperation. "Your Honor, I understand this is unusual, but I've done the research. I've prepared for this case as thoroughly as any lawyer would. My client deserves a fair defense." Judge Grayson's smirk widened. "Miss Carter, this is a court of law, not a stage for theatrics. Do you even realize the seriousness of what you're attempting?" "I do," Amelia said quickly, her voice unwavering. "And I also realize that my client's life could be ruined if they don't have someone fighting for them." A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the attorneys who had dismissed her earlier were beginning to look at her with a hint of respect. Judge Grayson frowned, clearly displeased with the shift in tone. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. "Your Honor, while I agree the situation is unconventional, I believe it's only fair to hear Miss Carter out. After all, the law is meant to ensure justice, not suppress it." Judge Grayson's frown deepened. He looked from Mr. Hayes to Amelia and back again, weighing his options. Finally, he sighed and leaned forward. "Fine," he said. "Miss Carter, I'll allow you to continue temporarily. But if I find you're wasting this court's time, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Amelia replied, relief flooding her voice. She took a deep breath and prepared to continue her argument. Amelia hadn't always been this fearless. Just a year ago, she had been an ordinary teenager, more interested in hanging out with friends than fighting legal battles. But everything changed the day her brother James was arrested. James had been Amelia's hero, smart, kind, and fiercely protective. He had been just 2 months away from finishing law school when he got into a fight with a wealthy businessman outside a bar. The man claimed James had assaulted him, and despite James's insistence that it was self-defense, he was arrested and charged. Amelia's parents had tried to help, but they didn't have the resources to hire a top-notch attorney. The public defender assigned to James's case was overworked and uninterested, barely putting up a fight in court. In the end, James was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Amelia had been devastated, watching her brother, a man who had dedicated his life to justice, become a victim of the very system he believed in. It shattered her faith in fairness. But instead of giving up, she decided to fight. She would learn the law herself, and she would find a way to make things right. Back in the courtroom, Amelia launched into her argument with renewed determination. Her voice was steady, her words precise, as she laid out the evidence in her client's favor. Her client, a middle-aged man named Mr. Peterson, sat beside her, looking both hopeful and terrified. He had been accused of embezzling funds from his employer, a charge he vehemently denied. Amelia presented documents proving discrepancies in the company's financial records, suggesting someone else could have been responsible. She quoted legal precedents that supported her client's right to a thorough investigation. The courtroom listened intently, even Judge Grayson, who leaned forward in his chair, his expression unreadable for a moment. Amelia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. But then Mr. Hayes stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "while Miss Carter's argument is impressive, it doesn't change the fact that she is not a licensed attorney. Allowing her to continue sets a dangerous precedent." The courtroom buzzed again, tension thick in the air. Judge Grayson looked at Amelia, his expression hard. "Miss Carter," he said, "I'll give you one last chance to explain yourself. Who gave you the authority to act as legal counsel in this case?" Amelia hesitated, her mind racing. She had prepared for this question, but now that it was here, her confidence wavered. She took a deep breath and opened her mouth to respond. But before she could speak, the door to the courtroom opened again. This time, it wasn't a suited professional who entered, but a young boy no older than 10. "Ethan's?" Amelia whispered, her heart skipping a beat. The boy ran toward her, clutching a crumpled envelope in his hand. "You forgot this," he said, thrusting the envelope at her. Amelia stared at him, her heart pounding. She recognized the envelope immediately. It was something she had never intended to reveal, not here, not now. But with the entire courtroom watching, she had no choice. What was inside the envelope, and why did it matter so much? Amelia's hands shook as she took it from Ethan. The weight of 1,000 eyes pressed down on her. "Miss Carter," Judge Grayson said sharply, "what's in that envelope?" Amelia hesitated, her mind racing. The envelope contained something she had never planned to show anyone, certainly not in front of a packed courtroom, and certainly not with Judge Grayson scrutinizing her every move. But Ethan, in his innocence, had brought it here, and now she had no choice but to address it. She started, her voice faltering. "It's nothing that concerns this case, Your Honor." Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Miss Carter, you're already walking a thin line. If you're withholding something pertinent to these proceedings, I assure you it will not end well for you." Amelia swallowed hard, feeling Ethan's small hand tug at her sleeve. His wide eyes looked up at her with pure trust. "Show them, Amelia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Her heart sank. The boy didn't understand the consequences of what he was asking her to do. But she couldn't blame him. He was just trying to help. She took a deep breath and glanced at her client, Mr. Peterson, whose expression was a mix of confusion and fear. Amelia's hands moved to open the envelope, but before she could, Daniel Hayes stepped forward again. "Your Honor," he interjected, his tone measured. "I think we're losing focus on the matter at hand. Miss Carter's possession of this envelope, whatever it contains, is irrelevant to her qualifications, or lack thereof, to represent a client." Judge Grayson raised a hand, silencing Mr. Hayes. "I'll be the one to determine what's relevant here." Amelia took a deep breath, steeling herself. If she revealed what was in the envelope, it could derail everything. But if she refused, Judge Grayson would likely hold her in contempt. The weight of the decision bore down on her, and for a moment, she felt completely alone. "Miss Carter," Judge Grayson said again, his voice now a low warning. "I won't ask you again. Open the envelope." Amelia's gaze flicked to Ethan, then to Mr. Peterson, and finally back to the judge. With no other options, she slowly tore open the top of the envelope and pulled out its contents. Inside was a letter, handwritten in her brother James's neat, meticulous script. Amelia's throat tightened as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words she knew by heart. The letter was a plea, James's final message to her before he was taken to prison. It was filled with encouragement, hope, and a challenge to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, no matter how impossible it seemed. Amelia's hands trembled as she held the letter, unsure of what to do next. The courtroom waited, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "What is it, Miss Carter?" Judge Grayson asked, his voice softer now, almost curious. Amelia hesitated, then folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. "It's personal," she said firmly, meeting the judge's gaze. "And it has nothing to do with this case." For a moment, Judge Grayson said nothing. The room was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed.
"Fine," he said.
"But understand this, Miss Carter. This is your last chance. Any further,